I am sure that in the last week, the last couple of days, even in your way to the Helmholtz horizons, you have read an article newspaper on the internet or a tweet linking forest fires, wildfires, to the rising of global temperatures. This is everywhere over the news, and well, I have to surprise you now. Wildfires are decreasing. And they are decreasing on a global scale with very little exceptions. But we can say that actually this impression, this expectation that we have that global temperatures are causing an increase in the intensity or in the area of wildfires is wrong. I hope that I will convince you in a minute. I will present the data, and we will look at the data together. But before that, I will try to explain why wildfires are important. Wildfires are, of course, important because they take lives, and they also destroy property, and they can be devastating for some landscapes, causing erosion. But on the global scale, from the climatic point of view, global fires, forest fires are also important. I will give you three numbers. I have chosen those three numbers to illustrate this importance. Every year, about 4% of land areas are burned. These are a very huge number. And we have to be aware that most of the areas are not actually represented in the news. Most of the fires occur in Africa. The second number is an example about the intensity of a forest fire. In Indonesia in 2015, over a week, there was a very intense fire. Perhaps some of you may still remember it. And the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by this fire, the rate was higher than the entire US economy, with all the SUVs and coal plants. So that gives an illustration about the importance of wildfires for the carbon emissions. On a global scale, this is a very average figure. Wildfires are approximately 20% of the anthropogenic industrial emissions. That already illustrates the importance of understanding the dynamics of wildfires. If, within climate change, wildfires become more intense, there's this number, 20%, could go up, 30%, 35%, making the climate problem even worse. If the contrary, if in the future wildfires shrink, reduce, they can ameliorate the climate change problem, although of course not solve it, but at least it will be a help. Now let's go through this contradiction between our expectations and the data that we have. Let me show you a model result, what is called a fire model, that is fed with fire weather in the future, as simulated by climate models, and they represent the fire risks. This is for the Mediterranean basin, and of course you see that risk actually increases with increasing temperature. This is our expectation. Higher temperatures, perhaps more dryness, cause an increase in wildfires. This is a very logical thinking. But we now look, for instance, at the data, in situ data, from Brazil. And we see that actually the amount of burnt area is decreasing. It has decreased in the last 15, 20 years. In other areas of the world, that they are actually measured by satellite remote sensing, they are able to spot the fires. If we look through Europe, temperature North America, Northern Hemisphere, South America, even Australia at the bottom of the plot, we see that actually the satellites are able to capture the fire season, so this pulsating up and down of the amount of fires, but actually they show either a stable line or even a decreasing number of burn area. And globally, as a global summary, showing this average from satellite observations, this is the black line, we see this reducing trend in the amount of burn area that we can compare with these fire models. that I showed you before, also at the global scale, that actually tend to show an increasing trend. They represent our logical expectations that higher temperatures will have to cause an increase in fires. There is a contradiction, right? And this contradiction is actually the paradise for a scientist. Actually, we see something unexpected in the data that is crying for an explanation. This is actually what a scientist would always like to have. And I would like you, in the rest of my time, try to convince you or try to show you how it will be possible to solve this problem, at least in part, to find out what are the drivers of wildfires and why they are not increasing so far. So temperatures are warming, but wildfires are not increasing. That means that our view of the link between warming temperatures and wildfires is too simplistic or incomplete. Perhaps there are other factors. Perhaps we are completely wrong in that respect. So we need to think harder and look from a wider perspective. So I would like to ask you now to together to look at a list of possible or drivers of wildfires that may explain this contradiction. The first hypothesis is, of course, well, wildfires are decreasing because the forested surface is also decreasing. And I'm going to show you the second surprise, because forest areas and forest greenness is also increasing in the last 20 years. And this is shown by satellite data as well, that measure the amount of reflectance from chlorophyll. And you see that in most areas of the world, the forests are getting greener and are increasing. So that cannot be an explanation for the decrease in forest fires. We have to look further for other drivers. So let's go very quickly through all these, well, some of these possible drivers and have a look at critical at them. One is temperature and dryness, of course, and there are examples of temperature and dryness causing wildfires, for instance, in Scandinavia last year. That was very clear. Other factor is wind, which is the main driver of fires in California right now. This temperature, dryness, and wind are the so-called climatic factors, but there are other factors. There are other factors that drive wildfires. They are the anthropogenic factors. And there's, for instance, power lines that spark fires. This is very clear also in California. Another factor is fire suppression or arson. Fire suppression is a very effective factor that drives also wildfires in some areas, that drive in the negative sense. They avoid wildfires. However, we have to be aware that fire suppression has a double-edged. At the very short time scale, of course, it suppresses fires, but at the long time scales, it causes more fires, more intense fires, because it leaves a lot of dead wood on the floor that actually acts as a fuel for the subsequent fire. And that's seen also in California right now. These very intense fires are possibly a result of the fire suppression of the past years. Another driver is grazing animals. Grazing animals keep the surface free of dead wood and bushes that could also be ignited by fires. And this is also a cause, for instance, in the European mountain regions and the abandonment of agriculture. It's a specific policy decision that drives wildfires, an anthropogenic factor. Okay, then we know that these factors are hard to disentangle. How we could solve this problem? Well, the idea is to look at periods in which only part of these factors are present, that is, look into the past 500 years in which the anthropogenic factors were not present, so we could support the idea or test the idea whether or not climate is linked to wildfires. And this is the project that I wanted to show you in the next few minutes. It was a project targeted to find out the climate, the past climate, and past wildfires in California over the last 500 years. And for this type of problem, actually, we need a very interdisciplinary help. And we counted for this, for instance, with Valerie, which is a dendroclimatologist, a very famous dendroclimatologist, with Eugene, which is a climate scientist, and Alan, which is an ecologist. You see all the expertise that are needed to solve this problem. And of course, you do not need only brain power, but you also need muscles sometimes. You have to take the probes and samples from trees to analyze the past climate and the past fire. How it is done? Well, from these trees we extract these scores, and these scores contain the information about past climate and past fires. For instance, when we look at the width of the tree rings, these are indicators of past temperatures or past dryness, and at the same time, the tree rings also show the scars of fires. So that actually, from the same sample, we can have a look at past climate and the past fires. This is an example, really, a real example for a cross-section of a tree, showing actually the tree rings and the scars of fires. So actually, we could then put side by side climate and fires in the past and see if there is a connection. This climatological data can be used to reconstruct past temperature, and this is an example of what has been done with this data worldwide. These are temperature reconstructions for several regions in the world that shows different climate states. For instance, 2,000 years ago, we had warm temperatures in the Roman warm period. We had also warm temperatures in the medieval warm period, and we had cold temperatures during the Little Ice Age. So the idea is, in those periods where wildfires more recent, or more intense, more frequent, or less, this is the idea. Using this data, we can not only reconstruct the temperature, but also reconstruct something else, something more. And that is combining this data with climate model simulations and using also machine learning methods, really complicated mathematical machine learning methods, to reconstruct the wind patterns over the last 500 years as well. And look if, for instance, fire seasons that we can identify in the trees are actually associated with shifts in the wind. So what we found from this project? We found actually two important things. The first thing is that in the pre-industrial period, there is a link between climate and wildfire. So our expectations were true. Dry climate, dry years, dry seasons are linked to more intense wildfires, at least in California. This is the first conclusion, the first important conclusion. The second conclusion was that in the 20th century, this link breaks down completely. That explains why we don't see a trend now in the wildfires, at least in California. And the reason is that the wildfires, at least in California, are not driven by climate anymore. They are completely driven by anthropogenic factors, by fire suppression, by grazing, by arson, and so on. What are the conclusions from this project? Well, I can show you also two conclusions. Wildfires are manageable. And actually, we show that in California, they have been already managed for over 100 years. So that allows actually for a sort of geoengineering in the carbon emissions that actually can be scaled. So starting from a small region and scaled globally. And the second conclusion is that this management of forest and forest fires that so far has been actually conducted on a regional scale, just taking into account the regional economies, will have now to include the carbon emissions characteristics, so the global climate in itself. And this is the conclusion which I would like to finish.